This is our digital church. You are all welcome here. Let us join with the prophet Jeremiah in our community's call to worship. As we search for a place of rest, the Lord appeared to us from a distance. I have loved you with a love that lasts forever. And so, with unfailing love, I have drawn you to myself. I will build you up, and you will be rebuilt. You will play your tambourines and dance with joy. You will plant vineyards that produce the fruit of the vine. Farmers will plant and then enjoy the harvest. The time will come when the watchmen shout from the highlands, "Get ready! Heaven is coming. Get ready for the Lord our God." Blessed be God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, and blessed be God's kingdom, now and forever. Amen. Let us come before the Lord with a spirit of thanksgiving and lift up our hearts in adoration. We gather in the name of Jesus Christ, who calls us to follow in the way of love. May the Holy Spirit guide us in our lives and draw us closer to God's holy presence. Let us offer our prayers and petitions to the Lord. May this time of worship be a source of strength and renewal.
Why do you test the Lord? Moses asked the unsatisfied people who left slavery. Feverish work, the burden of taskmasters who force them to make bricks without straw, to build empires from the sweat of their brow. Wandering loose in the desert, they were still slaves of their hearts, unliberated in their minds and their souls, unaware of God's presence with them, manna in the morning, life from hard and difficult places, water from rock, tasting salvation upon their lips. Deep calls to deep as our souls cry to you, O Lord. Asleep to the one who made earth and its seas, not being able to see the glory and the suffering, the hope and the pain. We strive to make sense of our turmoil and our toil, and we often miss the waters that are poured out around us and into us, and drinking in the presence of God. As we encounter the water at Jacob's well, depth echoes back, but we continue to thirst. For water is not dug from the work of our hands, to not drink from empty wells, broken cisterns that carry nothingness. In opening my eyes above these waters, I see my history in a pool of memories, committed to filling my own cup and sustaining my own thirst. Trying to quench a parched soul with one person or another, with one thing or another. Coming back to the void and seeing myself just looking straight back. I've eaten bread from the labors of my hand, threshed through fields, cut my hands on thorns and thistles, land lashing back at me, exchanging one job for another. This labor without end, only to find eternal retirement in the very dirt that I've tilled. The waters that call us to this place come from eternal springs, flowing forth from a distant garden to feed fertile grounds that yield a harvest of plenty, to fill desert lands, to spring forth from the heart so that we might do the work of the one who sent us, work full and filling, sends us forward to our awaited future.
please join me in a prayer of unity. You are all welcome at the table of God, every person, adult and child, for Christ brings peace to all, tearing down every hostile wall so that the many may become one heart, one family, one new humanity. For God, who is love, and Christ, who is all in all, show no partiality and make no distinction. So neither race nor class, gender nor sexuality, politics or religion, personality nor nationality count for us or against us. The light of Christ enlightens us all. Christ the prisoner and the naked, Christ the hungry and the sick, Christ the thirsty and the stranger, Christ the other. May God's Spirit hover over our chaos, our hatred and indifference, descend in our hearts with love and pleasure, blow us out into the world to listen and serve, and set us ablaze to forgive and reconcile, for we are all welcome at the table of God. We celebrate this with real food to join around tables, every person, adult and child.
We are continuing our sermon series on the Stations of the Cross. And today, as we look at Scott Erickson's art display, the pictures that I've chosen, number 5 and 6, are Jesus being given his cross and Jesus falls. So if you take a moment and look at those pictures and the art of Scott Erickson and how he depicts Jesus being given the cross and Jesus falling. I titled these stations Burdens and Flooding because I could just imagine Jesus experiencing a sense of overwhelming emotion as he's being handed the cross of crucifixion, being given this knowing that he is walking along the Golgothan way where he will be executed at the end. I could imagine anybody experiencing a sense of flooding and an emotional burden, a heavy weight that they are carrying, not just the weight of the cross, but the weight of just the situation is and would be overwhelming. So flooding. Flooding in trauma refers to a psychological response where a person is completely overwhelmed with emotion, intense memory or intense situation in and relating to a traumatic event that happened in the past or a traumatic event itself. So flooding can result in many, symptoms. So if we think about our own flooding and the experiences that we've had in flooding, the experiences of emotion that is overwhelming, like panic attacks or disassociation type behavior, the overwhelming experience of fear or anxiety or sadness. It's a natural response to trauma, flooding is. And I could imagine Jesus or just anybody, even the two criminals that were carrying their crosses or walking to their crosses. That would be an overwhelming feeling. That would be an overwhelming experience, knowing that you are actually going to die at the end of this journey. I guess during that time, you could come to some sense of resolve, because I think that the human mind and the human experience is there's some defense mechanisms that we have built inside of us just naturally, that we would be able to come to resolve that this is my fate. Yet at the beginning, or right at the start, the genesis of your walk, or the beginning of this, I guess, execution, that you would definitely experience an overwhelming sense of some kind of emotion. So John 19 records for us just a little snippet of, and a picture into the window of what is occurring as Jesus receives the cross. It says, "Then Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. The soldiers took Jesus prisoner. Carrying his cross by himself, he went out to the place called the Skull Place." And basically that in Aramaic is Golgotha. Golgotha is the name of the skull place. In Matthew 27:31, they led him away to crucify him. As they were going out, they found Simon, now this other person, a man from Cyrene. They forced him to carry his cross. When they came to this place called Golgotha, which means the skull place, they gave Jesus wine mixed with vinegar to drink, but after tasting it, he didn't want to drink it. Then in Mark 15, starting in the latter part of verse 20, it says, "Then they led him out to crucify him. Simon, a man from Cyrene, Alexander and Rufus's father, was coming in from the countryside. They forced him to carry his cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the skull place. But he handed Jesus over to their will." And then Luke, the last gospel depiction that I want to read, is as they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene, who was coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. So the debate, did Jesus actually carry the cross? Did Simon carry the cross? I would say both, that Simon carried the cross and Jesus carried the cross at some point, I would say. John tells us that Jesus did, and the rest of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, tell us that Simon carried it. I would say that that's just kind of a moot point in theology, where did Jesus carry it or Simon carry it? I think that Jesus probably did for a while, and Simon maybe did most of the work or most of the carrying. Who knows? I can't prove that either way. The church, though, has held another tradition, and this is a challenge that is just a small challenge, that the church has held this tradition for a long time, that Jesus fell along the Golgothan path, the road to Golgotha, 3 times. And this is not recorded anywhere in Scripture. So I don't know when really exactly in the Middle Ages sometime this doctrine or this stations of this doctrine that are added to the Stations of the Cross in the Catholic tradition, 3 times Jesus falls. Now, I would say that in a lot of theology, there's something called a pause or theological pause to reflect. So when theology is written, many times a dramatic pause is written within the theology. And so this Golgothan pathway, I would say 3 times Jesus falling, is one of those theological pauses to just bring our minds to the reality of the humanity of Jesus, where Jesus probably fell. I mean, if Jesus didn't fall, that would be just kind of, I guess, a fake or just unrealistic depiction that Jesus actually didn't fall carrying the cross or after being whipped. I'm sure he fell a lot more than 3 times. But for some reason, the church definitely wrote in, and it's common sense, right, that they would have written in that Jesus fell. And honestly, no judgment if you believe that, no judgment if you don't believe that. I think that there's more to the story, though, than Jesus just falling. There's an emotion behind, or a reality of spirituality that we need to discover on this cross way. So use your creative imagination about the story. I think The Passion of the Christ, the movie, definitely used a lot of creative imagination. I think that we too can use a lot of creative imagination when we're thinking about the road to the cross. So I want to spend some time looking at the weakness of Jesus and the carrying of burden, the possible emotion of flooding behind the weight of this situation. And I think that the church did a good job in placing those pauses in, just to show that Jesus was very human in this situation. Now, most of the sermons that I've heard on these gospel depictions of Jesus and the cross, or the cross in general, is all about us carrying our crosses, where there's an individual cross for us to bear, and every struggle that we are offered to God, every struggle that we must bear, that God can't give us more than we can handle, and even though it feels like it sometimes, that our sermons are very directed towards the cross that we carry. Those are all important themes, and I think that, well, there's scriptural that we must carry our own cross. But I want to focus on the context of Jesus and the acceptance of his cross, where he accepts basically already having to struggle, but he also accepts struggling more and will continue unto his death. So if you think about the context before this event, and all that Jesus had gone through, scorned by people and abused, wrongly accused in front of an angry crowd. A lot of times we depict Jesus in our minds. We have this imaginative Jesus in our minds, that he has perfect hair, and he has clean skin, and he has this pure, holy expression, like this smile with a lamb, and that's the picture on our grandma's wall. And I think that that's a beautiful depiction and wonderful depiction of Jesus sometimes, but I often forget to look at the fact that Jesus was actually a human being. So imagine Jesus at this point sweating, right? He sweat in the garden as if it was like blood. And so here he actually has blood on his head and on his back and on his body, tired maybe of standing trial and going through the turmoil, dirt maybe in his hair, just matting his hair with blood and water, sweat and such, being shoved around by guards, and he's offered this heavy wooden cross. I want to just focus on that Jesus for a moment. The tired, sweaty, I just ran a marathon Jesus, where he is not crossed the line. He has another 5 miles maybe to go. This is the cross that will be his end, and really just like almost the beginning, but we've gone through all of this other stuff as well. So Jesus is very, very human. Very, very raw human at this moment. I think oftentimes we do think, though, in this moment, when Jesus carries his cross, that we think about and we look at our crosses as well, whether it be like something that we don't like that we're having to endure. That's like the cross we have to bear. Like that's a simple, almost like first world problem that we have. Like we have this problem, that's the cross I have to bear. So whether it be a job that we dislike, or a person or a friendship that we're struggling with, maybe something a little more serious, maybe something just that next level, not just some simple first world problem, but maybe it's a health condition that we are suffering, that we have a health condition that is terminal or chronic in our lives. Imagine like suffering from just chronic illness. Maybe that's the feeling that you have of the cross that you have to bear. I think that my cross many times is the too many things to do to take care of cross. I have to do a lot of different things. So the result of that is struggling to acknowledge or remember to acknowledge maybe the simple things my kids are accomplishing. They come to me and they say, "Dad, look at what I did." And I don't maybe think it's as big of a deal as they think. And I maybe just brush it off. "Hey, that's great. Thanks for sharing." But it's just, I'm not acting noticeably excited over their accomplishments. And maybe I even say, "Okay, that's great. Let's go," because I'm in a hurry because I have other things to do. So too much to do could be your cross to bear. Maybe I have to remind myself at those moments that just because I have too much to do, it's not necessarily a cross to bear. That I have to remind myself of the tired, sweaty, maybe nervous Jesus, that Jesus carried a lot for me, that I can carry some of those simpler things. The one that looks like me, the one that acts like me, the one that feels like me, the one that takes it anyway, right? That kind of Jesus, the one that struggles for us. So then I look at the things, the crosses that I'm trying to bear, and I have to remind myself maybe that if my Lord can trust that his Father in heaven, that the Creator in heaven will see Jesus through this suffering, that God can see me through my suffering as well. I told somebody the other day that I was the bigger person in an event in my life. And then I responded, "I'm tired of being the bigger person. Someday someone else is going to have to be the bigger person." I'm reminded of the sweaty, tired, bloody Jesus at that moment. And I'm reminded of this scene, and it reminds me I can continue to be the bigger person because Jesus suffered in this way, in this very human way. And I can take on some of these smaller sufferings in my life. So this moment in Jesus and the cross and the Golgothan way, the Jesus of Nazareth taking the cross upon himself, carrying it to the hillside, marks a turning point. It actually marks, this is a very significant turning point in the history of Christianity, but the history of human history. It's a symbol of shameful death, reserved for lowest classes and such. And it's also the doorway to a very deep mystery that is revealed in the cross, that God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that his son would die for us. That is God's love. So we see at this moment, at this crucible moment, the change in human history where God's love has no limits. God's love has no limits. And we see God's love being revealed to the world in such a way. Before this time, in religiosity or the system of religion, it seemed like the love of God had a lot of limits, where we had structure, we had religious systems, we had kind of a process to go through in order to access God's love. That's what was taught. That was what was shown by the religious system or the leaders. But now we see in this scene, the Messiah is here and has come in a very different way. History then turns towards a very human Jesus that is also divine in such a way. And people will experience God's love. All people will experience God's love through this scene. And when he carries the cross, when he receives the cross, when Jesus is over, let's say, whelmed, maybe he fell, maybe he didn't, right? In this scene, maybe that's why Simon of Cyrene had to carry it, because Jesus even couldn't carry it. I don't know. But even in this scene, the scene is so important because history, it points its direction now towards God and human beings and our relationship on this road, that God's love has no limits on the road to Golgotha. And this is a huge turning point that is seen in this cross, Jesus receiving the cross. Now, I wonder about Simon, because Simon, I did a deep dive on Simon this week, because all we're told in this text really is maybe his kids and maybe where he's from. I'm wondering how his day went before this scene, right? I'm wondering maybe if he had a clue about what he was about ready to endure. And maybe he hadn't even heard of Jesus before. I have no idea. Maybe he hadn't heard of Jesus, and I'm wondering what he was thinking as he's entering into this moment, maybe being grabbed by a guard, being told what to do. I mean, what did he do for a living? Was he the egg carrier? Was he the egg delivery guy? Really, we don't really know. But I'm wondering, after he carried the cross, maybe what did he do for a living? After he carried the cross, what did he do with that message? What did he do with his life after that? I mean, if you think about it, the blood, the spit, the tears, the sweat, right at the end, I mean, he was probably covered in that. What was he thinking during the whole time? And then here's the key question for me with Simon's life. Is what did he do with that message afterwards? Because he actually is the one that carried this cross. And some people believe Jesus didn't even carry the cross, that Simon's the one who carried the cross. So how did that affect his whole life? Whether he did or not, I think both of them did at some point. But how did that affect his life? Did it change him? Did he become a Christian? Did he all of a sudden become this follower and this worshiper of Jesus? I mean, it's hard to imagine that it didn't affect his life. I mean, if you went through such a thing, the flooding, the carrying of this burden that all of a sudden you're thrown into, I couldn't imagine it not changing his life. I couldn't imagine it not making a difference in him. I mean, you're talking a day of extremes, right? I mean, you have an extreme crowd, you have extreme abandonment, you have the message of really love and sacrifice in the act of being sacrificed. And so some people are seeing an extreme amount of maybe love that Jesus has expressed in his life and the 3 years of his ministry, but you also see an extreme amount of hate in this scene as well. You see sympathy, you see anger, you see mercy, you see cruelty. You have this king, but then he has thorns on his head, right? And so God is basically present, but God is the homicide victim. And Simon is carrying this scene. Simon is actually carrying the cross, but Simon is carrying this message along with him. It's almost like Simon is us, where we see Jesus, and Jesus is going to the cross, but then Simon is walking with this scene. He's walking with this cross. So Simon carries this cross past mockers. He carries this cross past wailing people, especially women. He carries this cross past Roman occupiers. He carries it past soldiers and military. He carries it past maybe confused people, what is going on? Maybe some visitors were there and they're foreigners. Maybe they're confused foreigners. And maybe even a few disciples and the moms there. And he's just carrying this cross along the way. And he not only carries the cross, but he carries the mockery and the jeers towards him. And he's carrying the sorrow and the pain and the hurt and the dirt and the blood, right? That's what Simon is carrying. Just think about how this affected him. Imagine being Simon at this moment. What must have gone through his head when they seized him and all of a sudden he is thrown in this position? Was he embarrassed? Was he frightened? Was he afraid to be associated with this criminal, that's being crucified and condemned and suffering unto death? I mean, I'm sure that he was confused with so many people that maybe were there. Why was he chosen? Why was Simon the one that was picked out? I guess that maybe he was just shocked that he was cherry picked out of a crowd. I mean, think about, he's just like everybody else, where something's happening and your eyes are down and you're just like, oh my goodness, like it's like the teacher asking a question in class and your head is down and you don't know the answer to the question and you don't want to be picked. You don't want to be chosen to answer the question, so you just put your head down. So I'm sure that just everybody along the way is weeping and crying and such and having emotional response. But then when the soldiers are looking for somebody to carry the cross, eyes are down and we're not going to show an interest in that task. So we find Simon in other Gospels. We find Simon in Mark. We actually find the expanded version of Simon giving us more information in Mark, which is really interesting because Mark is not like, he's not liberal with the details, right? So Mark is it's a short book, to the point, and very efficient. And for some reason, the author of Mark has decided to expand Simon's life. And Simon pops up in Mark 15, like we read before. And Mark writes this: Simon, a man from Cyrene, Alexander and Rufus's father, was coming in from the countryside. They forced him to carry his cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the skull place. Both Luke and Mark give his name and his place of origin. Both say that he's coming from the countryside. Both seem to emphasize, Luke and Mark emphasize, that Simon is no way connected in the events of today. It's not like Simon was Jesus's best friend or something. And Mark says that he was passing by, just like this little note, passing by. That's the translation in some older translations. So he wasn't even hanging out as a spectator. But Mark says something really important that I think needs to be talked about. He says Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. So why in the world did Mark say, hey, by the way, he's the father of these two boys? We're not told much. I mean, church art has told us a lot. Church history has told us a lot that Alexander and Rufus and Simon were all there at the scene. So church history, whether it be a communal historical knowledge that Alexander and Rufus were there, I have no idea. And it's made for great imagery, definitely. But Mark felt it necessary to point out that Alexander and Rufus were very present. Maybe they became Christians. Maybe they were important to the story later. I mean, Rufus pops up in a few places, especially one place in the Bible, but also in a lot of church history. So maybe they saw it. Maybe they were eyewitnesses to it. That's my guess, is that Mark thought it would be important to include them because they were eyewitnesses to the scene, and then maybe people could go to them, talk to them about, say, hey, Rufus and Alexander were there, so let's go talk to them about what happened. Or possibly their father came back and just told them about it later. We don't really know. My guess would be that Alexander and Rufus actually were eyewitnesses to the scene. So there was an incredible, if you think about this, there's an incredible sermon that is being told in Simon, Alexander, and Rufus's life. Now, I think that everyone lives and preaches a sermon. Their life is a sermon. Everyone's a preacher. Just what are we preaching? Who are we preaching to, right? And Simon is pressed. He's forced into service. And I think that God uses that in a very magnificent way. God uses that in a very, very special way. You might not even know the sermon that you're preaching. I many times don't know the sermon that I'm preaching, not this formal sermon on Sunday morning. I'm talking about our life and just how our life is expressed. Whether they saw this scene transpire or they heard about it afterwards, Dad gave them a great sermon. And the situation gave them a great sermon. I think that God can take our life, our burdens, our flooding, our crosses that we carry, like on behalf of Christ, that God can use our lives as sermons as well. Simon was just passing through, and I think that that's important as well, that he's not there as a spectator of Jesus, an onlooker to see Jesus, and all of a sudden his direction has changed. Like his Google Maps, his Apple Maps are all of a sudden, I guess glitch, and he's off course now, and the rest is history. And he's put on this pathway. He's put on this pathway of extremes and lessons that are learned. And oh my goodness, could you imagine that night at dinner, like what he said to his family after this was all done? I mean, you would never guess what happened to me today, right? And he just goes off on like just what had happened. In German, the stations of the cross are called the Kreuzweg. And the Kreuzweg is a neat little word. It literally means the cross way, the cross way. And Simon was put on the cross way. And Simon and Alexander and Rufus, they were all put on the cross way. And honestly, when I thought about this story and when I thought about Jesus taking the cross, the amount of emotions that he was experiencing, but just that walk to Golgotha and experiencing all that he experienced and carrying something that he didn't want other people to carry any longer, that he was going to carry this. I want to be put on the crossway too. I want to be put on the Kreuzweg. I want to be on that, meeting Jesus on the Kreuzweg as well. Why? Because it changes us. It transforms us. It makes us something different. You know what? Going through certain things, carrying certain things in our life, I think helps us to love better. It helps us to love deeper. It can help us to love better. It can help us to love deeper. And I think about the crossway starting at our baptism, but ending in ultimate forgiveness, where Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. I think about that Jesus proving that forgiveness in the resurrection, but that's our life too. When we walk the crossway, when we walk the Kreuzweg, we experience an immense amount of grace and an immense amount of love of God. We understand when we walk with Jesus in relationship, we understand forgiveness more, we understand grace more, we understand love more. And what seemed like in Simon, what seemed like the worst day of his life, becomes the most transformative experience and moment for eternity in Simon and his family. And I could just imagine Simon leaving that scene and experiencing all that he experienced and being transformed without even realizing it, being transformed into the love of God, into the grace of God and the forgiveness of God. And as we develop a relationship with Christ, as we become closer with Christ, I pray that all of us would be on the Kreuzweg. All of us would walk behind Christ, that we would walk along Christ, that we would see Christ on the crossway, and our love and our grace and our forgiveness would grow deeper and deeper as well. For who? For our neighbors, for ourselves, for God as well.
Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26, "I received a tradition from the Lord, which I also handed on to you. On the night on which he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread. After giving thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this to remember me.' He did the same thing with the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Every time you drink it, do this to remember me.' Every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you broadcast the death of the Lord until he comes." When we gather together, we remember Jesus through the act of communion. Communion gives the idea of togetherness. All around the world, every day, believers and searchers perform communion. It's a simple act. It's just bread and wine. But it is in the pause, remembering, and thanksgiving that our hearts are turned outward to others. Communion is for all. No matter where you are at on your faith journey, the table is open for you. All that is required from us is that we have a truthful conversation of where our hearts are at. Jesus knows us, our deepest and darkest and brightest, and we are all invited to communion. So take the bread, dip it into the juice. We remember the sacrifice of Jesus and the reason we are here today. Take and eat. And we say thanks be to God.